Okay, so we'll get started. Hari Om, everyone. Om. Om. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Parthaya Pratibodhitam Bhagavatam Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Kratitam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitam Vridavarshinim Bhagavatim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatvam Anusandathami Bhagavad Gita Bhavatveshini Namostute Vyasa Vishala Buddhe Pulla Ravindayata Patra Netra Yena Tvaya Bharata Taila Purnaha Prajvalito Jnanamayah Pradipaha Prapanna Parijataya Totra Vetraika Panaye Jnanamudraya Krishnaya Geetam Rutatuhe Namaha Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudra Marutaha Stunvanti Divyaistavaihi Vedai Sangapadakramopanishadaihi Gayanti Yam Samagaha Dhyana Vastita Datkatena Manasa Pashyanti Yam Yoginaha Yasyantam Navidusura Suraganaha Devaya Tasmai Namaha Devaya Tasmai Namaha Sarvadharman Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Vraja Aham Tva Sarva Papebhyaha Mokshayishyami Ma Shuchaha. So I introduced one more of the six Dhyana shlokas. The last one is a very important one as well. So I thought I would do that today. We haven't used that as the shloka, as a starting shloka. So we are in the culmination of the first part of understanding the whole philosophy of life. We will come to one of the great Mahavakyas, which points out to our true nature. But before we need to know our true nature, we need to really understand really who is the I that I have identified with always. So in this chapter of sixth chapter, which is the meditation chapter, or as it says here, the yoga of self-abidance, Atma Sanyama Yoga, or you can say even Dhyana Yoga, you will see it is essentially a disciplining chapter. A disciplining chapter, which is, now that we have understood, at least theoretically, this aspect of my essence, how can I pull myself to recognize that essence of myself? And that can happen only through a discipline. So we will dwell a little more on this aspect of the essence of this chapter. What does it mean disciplining? What does it mean dwelling on my essence? So the reflection time today is really on reflecting what are the things that pulls me away from reflecting on my true self. As I've always said, we have this Jekyll and Hyde kind of personality within us, right? There is this one personality, which is the transactional personality, where Sunitha is interacting with this world. Sunitha uses her sense organs, her mind, her intellect, and everything to do everything that is required in the world. However, the problem is she identifies herself so totally with who Sunitha is that it's hard for her to recognize there is something else behind it, which is powering who this Sunitha is, right? So it is in this sense that the sixth chapter is slowly turning our attention all the way from the first chapter to the sixth chapter, where it is really the cultivation, direction, and this application of my whole thought process. This whole thought process, this whole aspect of this emotions with which I really feel that I'm Sunitha, and I go in with this in every action. I bring in this emotional feelings and everything. And now it is a matter of resetting a mind to recognize that same thoughts and feelings what I have, to convert that motives and that mental attitude towards true values. I mean, I don't think you can see what this brain is thinking here, but this whole thing is that it is in our brain, where, of course, it's not the brain that is acting, it is the mind, which really is motivating us to go different places. So idea is, how can I now revolutionize that mind which is there in my brain into recognizing something else? So it is not as if I'm going somewhere else to do this. It is not as if I'm going to the Himalayas to do it, but in and through where I am, sitting where I am, doing everything, just a shift, a paradigm shift in my personality. That's what I'm trying to do here. So this is a beautiful quote from Gurudev Swami Chinmayananda, which I don't know how many of you follow this on Facebook. There is a Facebook page for Swami Chinmayananda, where we have the admin of CCMT who puts in regular quotes. They're just so beautiful. And I thought it really reflected what we are trying to study in this chapter as to why sixth chapter is important. So sixth chapter is obviously important because our mind is constantly restless, and again, I don't want to give away the analogies here, but you will see it. It is basically a mind which is restless. And because a mind is constantly restless, it leads to what others perceive us in a certain way, and that is our character. So our restlessness actually reflects in our character, in our unsteadiness of it. And that is what people judge us by. And this chapter again brings to a state where I can actually recognize this mind, recognize the unrestlessness, and try to reset it. So that is the whole idea behind this chapter, what you will see. And why is that very important? The reason it is important is because we are so limited. We are so limited, and I'll open this floor to you all to recognize this restlessness that we talked about. And this restlessness is now brought about by a certain limitation. So what are the limitations in ourselves which brings about this restlessness? I know they seem like two contrary things. On one side, it seems like because my mind is unlimited, it's restless and it can go places. But on the same lines, we are also limited, because of which it causes restlessness. So let me open this floor to you and ask you, what are your thoughts when you connect this restlessness of our mind to our limitedness? what are we limited by in our world today? One may think, I'm really not limited at all. I have the power to do anything and everything I can. I have the money, I have the resources, I have the people, I have all this. What am I really limited by?
Samsara? Bondage.
Samsara, bondage. Yes, very good. Anant, as always, goes straight to the source. That is true. We are limited by our samsara bondage, but more practically in our day-to-day lives, because this is very important. This 5 chapters that we've seen so far has given us the knowledge that it is the samsara, the bondage. But in most practical terms, what are we limited by?
Not to able to control our thoughts.
Not to be able to control our thoughts. That is true. What does it mean, you think, that controls our thoughts?
I would say discipline.
True, but what I'm saying, discipline controls. But today, when I'm acting in the world, there is something else which is pushing my thoughts to go a certain way, right?
Vasana or desires.
The
Vasanas, that is true.
Desires, attachments.
Vasanas and attachments, that is true. But more importantly, I think, is this one thing, which is actually the mindset. The mindset which is brought about by our mind. So our mindsets, it consists of so many things, our own beliefs, our own assumptions, our beliefs about what is right and wrong, what is our political system should be and what should not be. I think just yesterday, the election results were announced, right? So we all had a certain view of who is going to be winning and now how America is going to be shaped by, or India for that matter. And we have certain assumptions that this is exactly how I think should be, or our attitudes with which we actually carry ourselves and our environment. And I can tell you, for me personally, it has been a big shift in my own assumption about my environment. From US to India, we constantly, it's this mindset that needs to be adjusted, because that's the mindset with which we act in this world, which shapes our attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions, right? And of course, all this starts from our own childhood, through our own lineage, our social environments, our education. All this changes how we think. But the idea is that mindset, in some ways, is very beneficial for us, but in many ways also it makes us limited. And I think that's what I wanted to address upon. And because of that limitation, which is of course bound by everything that you all said, which is our individually, it is my vasanas, but externally also the things which is an extension how my vasanas perceive things, that tends to limit us. So this is why this chapter is so very important, because it is telling us that our own mind and our mindset limits our own beliefs, and we need to grow out of it. And that is the whole idea behind why this idea is needed for meditation. Now, I know it looks like I've jumped from a place where I said about limitation and I talked about assumptions and beliefs. And now I'm saying that in 6th chapter, we are talking about meditation. Well, in this last 5 chapters, we learned some very crucial tenets, if you will. And I'm sure you will all say the 2 tenets that we figured right away is, one thing is, I need to give up my fruits, my attachment to the fruits of action. That was very clearly said from the 2nd and the 3rd chapters, correct? So which means me as this limited, where I limit myself to be this body, mind, intellect, and driven by my vasanas, I am totally attached to this world of objects, emotions, and thoughts, where I pay a lot of attention to my attachment or what I'm getting out of it. So that was one particular tenet that we got through so far. The second one is going up this scenario here. What Bhagavad Gita has reminded us from the chapter 4 and 5 is not only do I have to give up my attachment to the fruits of action coming from this field of objects, emotions, and thoughts, but I actually need to even give up the notion that I am the perceiver where I'm using the body, or I'm the feeler where I'm using the mind, or the thinker where I'm using the intellect. So even this part of it, I need to give up. So these two things through actually today's our 91st lecture. So in 90 hours, so to speak, we have actually studied why I have to give up, why this leads to a lot of stress, and even more so is going one more level up when I give up this notion of the fact that I'm perceiver, feeler, thinker, then I'm actually going to the root cause of all the stress, the anxieties, the worries, everything that I feel. So this is exactly the reason why we need meditation, which is when we say meditation, also, we talked about last time also, this is not the conventional way of meditation, how we look at it. Here, this meditation is where I am truly trying to now practice the mechanics of giving myself the time for all this knowledge to sink in. That is what this whole idea here is. At the highest level, we talked about again last time, I'm just trying to reiterate everything we spoke. Meditation is absolutely not a verb. Meditation is actually a noun. Meditation is a state. It's a state of being where I am in complete tune, where Sunitha has lost her identity and her Atman, if you will. I'm using very simplistic words here. English is by no means the right language to convey this, but in a sense, that essence of who I am is in complete sync with that absolute state of consciousness. That is actually the state which is the meditative state. And in that sense, meditation is a noun. Meditation is a state of being. So that is the idea which we are getting into. But we are using the word meditation in 6th chapter in some sense as a verb, because you will see that in this chapter, there is a lot of mechanics that is spoken about, where how, in order to get into that state, what are all the preparatory things I need to do? So the preparatory things are all the things where with the first, actually the first 10 shlokas of 6th chapter gets into also trying to convince us about why, again, we need to do meditation. And slowly it gets into the mechanics of how to do meditation, starting with controlling the environment, controlling my body, and then slowly getting into that state. So that's where it leads to. And with the ultimate area of when that whole meditation is practiced, it is like the mind is totally under my control, and it is not restless at all, which I showed that quote there, but it is like the single flame of a lamp, where it's totally not flickering at all. It's just unwavering. And that is the ultimate state. So this is the introduction to the chapter itself, which we are getting into. So in the first 6 chapters, we saw, it literally leads to, as Minu rightly pointed out, it is the discipline we're getting into. It's the discipline of understanding myself, that I am that absolute state of meditation, which is that noun as I spoke about. And to get to that state, the first 5 chapters was like a knowledge that was given to us. Because without the knowledge of why I'm going to meditate, it would be extremely hard for anyone to just sit and then transport themselves to that state. So from the first chapter, where we were exposed to, the state of Arjuna, who is in a state of conflict, you see how Krishna has built it up through all these chapters, the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th, to leading to that disciplined state. So literally, this is the state of discipline. It's a state of sadhana that we are going to be looking at in this chapter. And we saw last time also that the Mahavakya, Tat Tvam Asi, as I showed you in this here, this idea of this is the Tat, the state of consciousness, and this whole thing below is the Tvam part of it. And the whole idea is I need to recognize that I am that absolute consciousness, Tat. And so therefore, Bhagavad Gita has come with, or this is again a great interpretation by one of the masters, who said that, basically Bhagavad Gita in all these 18 chapters shows you how that Tattvam Asi, that thou art, focuses on the first 6 chapters being the Tat or thou, that is me, to establishing the relation to that Tat, and Asi being saying that, you are related to that who you are, that thou art. That one is the whole idea which we are seeing here. One more piece of information which one can relate to here is, we know that there are 3 essential paths to that absolute state of understanding who I am, or that state of liberation. And that is the karma, upasana, and jnana khandas, or these 3 paths. So the first 6 chapters, you can say, is devoted to the karma yoga. The next 6 is the upasana yoga, or upasana kanda. And the last 6 chapters are for the jnana yoga, starting from the 13th chapter. So that is the idea behind this.
Hari Om, is the
Yes.
Upasana Kanda same as Bhakti Yoga?
No. Well, let's see. Maybe you can, to some, partly yes, partly no, I would say. Upasana Kanda is also very meditative. It's basically sitting in one place and then recognizing, of course, your relationship with the universe, but also understanding the environment, having a very holistic picture. So, for example, if you see from 7th through 12th chapter, which ends in the Bhakti yoga, which is probably why, Anant, you're asking. But Upasana Kanda is also very contemplative nature. So contemplation is what you would call as Upasana. Contemplation on, like, in the 10th and the 11th chapters, for example, one is contemplating upon who Krishna is, what is the sagunatva of Brahman. That saguna upasana is actually what is talked about here from the 7th through the 12th chapters.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So in the 6th chapter, you see in the first 10 shlokas, Krishna actually sort of creates an inquisitiveness in Arjuna. He uses that to, because, our mind again is so restless, and you see that even Arjuna's mind is very restless up to this chapter because he is asking a lot of questions. Of course, his questions are becoming more and more mature. We saw that in the 5th chapter. But in a sense, that mind needs to be quietened down now. That mind, the only way you quieten down is if you give the mind something which the mind can relate to. It's just like, when a child is crying and you give the child a candy, and the child just quietens down. So our mind is like that child. It needs that knowledge in order to quieten down. Until then, the mind has been, and this can of course happen only when the mind is ready to be quietened down. That also is there. So 6th chapter focuses on creating that readiness of the mind. And then in the first 10 shlokas, Krishna actually starts to understand or starts to help Arjuna understand the reason for quietening the mind. So all that is where you see the first 10 verses going. So in the first 3 shlokas itself, because you see even in the 5th chapter, Arjuna asks this question about sannyasam, karmanam, yoga. He asks him, really, how is sannyasi different than a karma yoga, and what is important for me, etc. So he, in this 6th chapter, the first shloka itself, he again, Krishna sort of, in a very, in a way that, Arjuna can relate to it, he, a little bit of, not satire exactly, but he tries to bring him understand really who's a householder, who's a sannyasi, and he uses some words like a fire and things like that. So we'll see how that is, how he does this. So in shloka 1, he's actually again going back to understand, showing who is a sannyasi and who's a yogi. So there are 2 kind of parallel ideas. In 5th chapter, in the beginning, when he says, what is sannyas and what is karma, there Krishna explains explaining really who is a sannyasi by Yona Dveshtina Kankshati, explaining about the dualities, how a sannyasi is about dualities, and etc. But here he's explaining about coming to how this may seem there are 2 parallel ideas. A sannyasi is different than a yogi, but he's trying to synthesize them both together. And he's trying to tell that a sannyasi is no different than a yogi. So, one is a yogi is a person who is integrated in his mind and intellect and who is not anxious for the fruits of action. Whereas a sannyasi could be a person who is not only given up the fruits of action, but he's also given up his sense of agency. So does that mean they're really 2 different? No. That is why he says, Anashrita karma phalam karyam karma karoti yaha sasanyasi cha yogi cha na niragnir na chakriyaha. So he's straight away he's saying that a sannyasi or a yogi is really no different when the person totally, a sannyasi also, for example, this is why he's saying karyam karma karoti yaha. A sannyasi is also a person who is sometimes bound by, bound means not attached the way we are this, but a person who is already always focusing on making sure that he's following what his path is. And so he says, Anashrita karma phalam, without really depending upon the results of actions, without depending on that, a person who does his karyam, which is his nitya karmas and his naimittika karmas. We said nitya karmas, which is our karmas, which are our duties as a householder, for example. Naimittika karmas which come at different times of our life. So when a person does this both, such a person is it doesn't matter whether he's a sannyasi or yogi, it is the same thing. Na niragnir na chakriha. Now let us look at what this means. Sa sannyasi cha yogi cha na niragnihi na chakriyaha. So you see that, basically Arjuna thought that a sannyasi is somebody who is completely giving up his activities, and not doing anything at all. Such a person is really can run away from everything that he's doing. So Krishna is basically somehow, he's actually laughing at Arjuna's misconceptions. He wants to drive home really the point that the same thing, they're not two different things, they are the same thing. So one doesn't really have to give up the fire in order to perform meditation. So in the olden days, people would have, the fire, would maintain a kind of a sacrificial fire in the home. And I said last time, it means a fire is basically like the Agnihotra. So Agnihotra is, and people, are called Agni, or people who followed that ritual, they were called Agnihotris. And in Gujarat, even now, there are so many families who really have this, a fire which is constantly burning in the house. They're, basically just indicating, the life of a householder. That is what the sacrificial fire really means. So absence of fire doesn't mean that you are actually giving up the duties of a householder. So what he's trying to say is that one need not give up that fire to pursue meditation. What one needs to do is do the duties of a householder to the best possible way and give up just that attachment to the fruits of action. So you don't have to go to any ashram or anything to, give up all this action or anything, etc. Basically, karma yoga itself means ultimately where not only you're giving this attachment to fruits of action, but you're also slowly starting to give the sense of the doership, the fact that it is I, Sunitha, who's doing it. The idea is, how can I really get rid of that aspect of who I am, that aspect of Sunitha-tva, if you will. So that is really the qualification which is very necessary for this idea of being a sannyasi. So when we think about an action, right, there are essentially three kinds of action. Again, I'm breaking it down to how we deal in this world, So most people, we allow whatever action we want to do as a desire-driven action. I mean, it's like, what is in it for me? That kind of an action, right? So that is really what we would call as a desire-driven action, and people like that are called as bhogis. Bhogi is a person who does only for the sake of bhoga or pleasure. So that's pretty much one kind of action. A sannyasi is a person who has actually no desire for this kind of action at all. For such a person, the only thing that is driving him is that aspect of understanding my true essence. And that is what we call as liberation or moksha. So moksha is that aspect where it is an unselfish action. So slowly we are moving from desire-driven action to a desire-driven unselfish action. So our vasanas, they drive us. So our vasanas, when they drive us to do things, how can I actually change that same action? So for example, if I'm a chemist, right? I'm a chemist who has, studied to be a chemist, and I could use this knowledge of chemistry in such a way that I create things which will only satisfy me and me alone. That is the selfish action. But I can use that same desire-driven, which is my vasana for being a chemist, now to expand it in such a way that I create the world a better place. I use the same knowledge of chemistry to understand biochemistry, to understand my medicine, and so that same knowledge can be used differently. So that is why we are saying desire-driven. Ultimately, the idea is then it becomes as an obligatory action. So, for example, so this is just the idea of the transition from a desire-driven selfish action to desire-driven unselfish to finally an obligatory action. Obligatory is I'm here, I have a body, and I need to be of service in the world. So that's the thing which finally leads to the aspect of what a sannyasi is and what ultimately leads to a yogi. So this just the giving you an idea of sa sannyasi cha yogi cha, which leads to also an integration of your mind and intellect. So any questions so far in this shloka before we go to the second? But the key words are here. This is naniragnit nachakriya, is that one doesn't have to give up being a householder, because as you know, Arjuna really wanted to run away to become a sannyasi. But Krishna is kind of reminding him that, hey, Arjuna, you don't have to give up your household duties. And sacred fire here is referring to your household duties. And then for that matter, a sannyasi is not a person who does not do any action. That part also, he wants to bring a very important thing here. A sannyasi is not someone who just runs away and sits and does nothing. Even a sannyasi does some action, and that is the obligatory action that is needed. So such an individual is a sannyasi, a yogi. But then Arjuna probably is now confused a little bit, maybe. For him, again, sannyas means giving up completely and running away. And yoga means acting. So how do you really do this? How can you really be that way? So Krishna then continues here. Yam sanyasamiti prahuhu. Yam sanyasamiti prahuhu. Tam yogam tam vitti pandava. Yogam tam vitti pandava. Nahi sanyasta sankalpaha. Nahi sanyasta sankalpaha. Yogi bhavati kaschana. Yogi bhavati kaschana. So that which is called renunciation, Krishna reminds Arjuna, know that that itself is nothing but yoga. For example, and he says, Nahi asanyasta sankalpaha. Somebody who has not renounced imaginations cannot become a yogi. So even to perform actions in the world, one needs to be a sannyasi. That's what he's trying to say. If I need to perform my actions perfectly, I may be doing a lot of things in the world. I may be thinking I'm doing a great job, even in my seva. But then how do I know that that is not the ultimate of how an action has to be done? So that is why here he says, while the term sannyasam, it focuses on the renunciation, yoga focuses on that attainment aspect. It's literally yoga, the word yoga, which means integration of your mind and intellect. And how can the mind and intellect be integrated? Only when I give up all these fanciful imaginations. Sankalpa meaning fanciful imaginations. That's the term that Swami Chimananda uses in his book. What basically, if you look at it, is our mind is full of only these fanciful imaginations. We want this, we want the other thing, which is again driven by vasanas. All that is nothing but how the mind is leading us towards all these things. Today, I may have a t-shirt made from Gap or something like that. Tomorrow's the new brand comes. I want to have this new brand, and again, I sometimes pity the marketing people because they have to their imagination is in overdrive, they have to constantly be thinking about, okay, what next? How can I really lure all these people into buying all my things? And if we are not alert, we can also fall into that trap of just pulling my mind only into this buying scenarios, right? And that is the sankalpaha, which he's saying. Nahi asanyasta sankalpaha. So in order to even get to that state of yoga, I have to practice that renunciation of my fanciful thoughts. Only then can I really become a yogi. So a person cannot become a yogi just like that. He has to understand that he needs to detach himself from the world and slowly start to go further in. So that is yam sannyasam iti prahuhu tam viddhi pandava. So that itself is yoga. That itself is sannyasa. They are basically nothing but two sides of the same coin, no difference at all. So Krishna is, if you remember, the first chapter started with him trying to go away. I think somebody's, I need to mute somebody. Yeah. So idea is sannyas and yoga means the same thing. Krishna is just reminding Arjuna that you don't have to go anywhere. You just stay, you just do your duty. So just to convince him again of that, so tying in with the very first chapter, Krishna is just bringing these shlokas here to again reiterate the point and to tell Arjuna that again, maybe another way you could take the fanciful imaginations is Arjuna, was wanting to kill his, was not wanting to kill his cousins. And Krishna is trying to remind him, but it is your duty to perform your duty as a warrior. So don't have this fanciful imaginations that you can just run away. So any questions on how this could be valuable for us before we go to the third shloka? So also, again, a reminder to the word yoga here again is to yoke my mind and to constantly bring about that sense of alertness in my actions. So now coming to shloka number 3, very nice shloka where I had mentioned earlier about how this mind needs to be tamed. Now, what better way would be, can I tame than to give a beautiful example, right? So that is the part that you will see in the next shloka coming up is about taming the mind, but taming the mind by giving you an example which will drive home the point about taming. Arurukshur munir yogam. Arurukshur munir yogam. Karma karana muchyate. Karma karana muchyate. Yoga rudhasya tasyaiva. Yoga rudhasya tasyaiva. Shamah karana muchyate. Shamah karana muchyate. Arurukshor munir yogam. Karma karana muchyate. Yoga rudhasya tasyaiva. Shamah karana muchyate. So without getting to an actual example, which I will show you in the next slide, Krishna is telling Arjuna that if you really want to conquer this mind, which has got all these fanciful imaginations or the restlessness which is there in the mind, what do you have to do? So he says, Aruruksho, that is one who is wanting to have an upper hand, wanting to really control this mind. So one who is wanting to ascend, he's saying Aruruksho, beautiful words here, one who is desiring to ascend. Aruruksho, Munihi, that person who has been now convinced of that knowledge. Muni, Manana Shilavan, that is the terminology we've used before for Munihi, one who has understood the knowledge and who is wanting to now meditate or contemplate on that knowledge. Munihi Yogam, for one who is still wanting to climb up that path or who wants to achieve that yoga. Karma Karana Uchyate. Action is said to be the means. So again, going back to our looking at meditation as a verb versus noun, right? In this chapter, as much as it's called as Dhyana Yoga, you will see it is the act of getting into that state. So the contemplative act which we are talking about. So for that, action is needed. Karma Karanam Uchyate. So Karanam, which means the means. So karma is actually the means for it. And again, because with the use of the word yoga is pertinent to somebody who is practicing action. Then for that same person who has now used action as a means, yoga arudhasya tasya eva, for that same seeker who has now attained it, he's now throwing the opposite thing. He says, inaction is said to be the means. So first I use action to reach a certain state. But once I'm in that state of this, here we're not calling as still not yet the state of being or anything, but for the same seeker who has attained it, or maybe we could probably look at it that way too, for somebody who has now reached that state, inaction is said to be the means. So beautiful shloka, which again is talking about using action to get to a place, and then once having reached there, using the aspect of inaction or being in that state is said to be the means of reaching that place. Again, the word reaching doesn't mean an action. Reaching means being there in that state. So Aruruksha, one who has a desire to ascend, that person who has the desire to reach that state, action is the cause, action is the means. But for somebody who is already established or who is being convinced of that path, then for that person, just being in that state, the noun, the state of meditation is a noun, that is the only method. So that is the idea which he's trying to say, Aruruksha, for some, so it is, we've used these different terms before also, Chitta Shuddhi and Chitta Ekagrata. So in order to reach Chitta Shuddhi or the purity of mind, one needs to do action, but further to remain in that single pointedness, Chitta Ekagrata, you need to be, you just need to be there. That's all it is. So here we are with this example of somebody who is trying to climb a horse, essentially a horse rider. So this is the example that is sort of Swami Chinmayananda gives, and to show how we do this. In order for somebody who is, here we see this person with the horse, and in this second one, you see how he is already on the horse, very comfortable, he's riding it, right? So one who is wanting to mount this steed of the horse, and here we are looking at Arjuna. Krishna is referring to the rider as the Arjuna here. One who's trying to ride this. And again, that can be only a person who is a Muni, who is understood, who is a contemplative student. Such a person has to, and who is a person who has no ego and who is again, we said, who has renounced the desire for attachment of action and who has no ego. When such a person who wants to climb the horse, what does he do? Well, first, he takes the reins of the horse in his own hands, right? He has the reins and then he kind of holds the mane of that horse in his hand. And then he, tries to put one leg on the stirrup. The stirrup is the right. I think you can see the stirrup over here. And then you see the saddle itself. He tries to pushes the leg into the stirrup, which holds the stirrup here. And then he tries to get on it. And this is not very easy at all. If the horse is wild and if it's really much taller than you, it's really hard to get up on it. So that itself is sometimes the first step. Or, when you want to start riding a car, I remember the first time before I went to US for the first time back in the 70s, back in the 80s. 70s would be really backdating me, but 80s. When I went, I remember first thing I needed, and those days, of course, you had only stick shift. I would always first try to feel the clutch. What is a clutch? What is the accelerator? And I was always putting my leg on the accelerator, just trying to feel which leg I should press more on the clutch and the accelerator, because you don't want to press your right leg too much and forget that you have this clutch to hold on, right? So literally that needs a lot of practice in the beginning. And that's the aspect what he's trying to show here, which standing on that, putting your leg up, making sure you're able to sit and making sure you're able to hold the reins. All this is the first step of this Aruruksho Munir Yoga, that part of it. Arurukshuhu is the idea of how going through the motions, going through the steps of going up on the horse itself. But once you are on the horse, now the horse, you can think about it, the analogy is the horse is like our mind. You have to really cajole the mind, you have to work with the mind, you really have to know exactly what you need to do to discipline the mind. But once you have done that, then you can ascend the mind. And that is what Aruruksho is. That is why such a beautiful word is ascending the mind. And Aruruksho Munir Yogam Karma Karana Uchyate Yoga Rudasya Tasyeva Shama Karana Uchyate. Shama, which is being totally quiet. So after you have learned that art of mounting, then sitting on the road, you can just totally enjoy the ride. You don't have to do anything at all, right? And again, Swami Chinmayananda gives a beautiful example of going to sleep. Before I go to sleep, I have to do a lot of things. I have to first prepare my room. And again, if it is here in my house, I have to make sure there are no mosquitoes coming into the room. I have to put my mosquito net. And then I have to make sure the temperature of the room is just right, put my fan or AC or anything like that. And then slowly get my mind to cooperate with me. And once I do that, then I can just slowly glide into sleep. And once I get into sleep, I don't have to do anything. I just have to be in that sleep mode, right? So you see 3 different examples of how I can ascend the mind. So the mind needs to be really, really worked on. And that is what the next shlokas will come to, is what are all the things about getting up there? And so the example which in this horse, as I said, first, I hold the reins, I hold the mane, and then I put my leg on the stirrup, and then I get on the saddle, all that. But ultimately, getting up there and doing it, sitting there, I just enjoy the ride. I don't have to do anything. The horse is completely under my control. To that extent, I need to do this. So, any questions on this aspect? It sounds very easy, right? Sounds, which is doing just these steps and, mounting the mind itself. So what are our issues? Why are we not able to do this, go through these steps of Arurukshahu Munir Yogam? How can I get from Arurukshu to Yoga Ruda? Yoga Ruda Tasyaiva. I'd like to hear about why are we not able to even get to those first steps of putting a leg up and sitting on the horse?
Is Chitta Suddhi the reason?
Chitta Shuddhi, yes. But the question then is, what is preventing us from having a Chitta Shuddhi? Chitta Shuddhi means purity of the mind.
Again, it comes to agitations in the mind.
The agitations in the mind, yes. And the agitations, of course, are caused by my own imaginations on how things will turn out to be, right? I know Geeta's on the screen, and I know when Geeta's planning her trips, she probably would be so many times thinking about, okay, how is this trip going to turn out to be? Will I really get the accommodation? Will the flights be on time? Will there be no COVID hitting? Are there any more mutations coming up? Is the pharmaceutical companies working hard to make sure that my passengers might have a good time? So like this, we think about so many things in our mind, right? And recently, I heard my Acharya Swami Bodhatmananda speak about this, which is so beautiful. He says about how at the end of the day, whatever has to happen has already been decided. The way things are going to happen is already there. You don't have to think too much about what you're going to do, what if kind of scenarios. Because the only thing we need to do is trust that everything will go well. Not that you don't have to do this what if scenarios. To some extent, you need to do it, but don't get too hung up on those things. Because if you have done your homework well and you've led a good life, your own previous things will help you move forward, right? So that is the idea behind how we can use our own mind to convince ourselves to move forward. But in that sense, the shloka really talks about that Arurukshahu and Yoga Ruda. So I need to get to that state of Yoga Ruda, which is having established an integration of the mind. Only then can I sit for meditation. So again, these shlokas are trying to build us to recognize what are the issues before sitting for meditation. Why is it that our meditation is not successful? And what do I need to do in order to make it successful? We need to pay attention to all these pre-actions. And that is why Karma Yoga is the prerequisite. If I do my Karma Yoga very well, I don't have to worry about getting into meditation. Whereas today we see so many people putting the cart in front of the horse, which is putting a lot of effort into trying to meditate without understanding what are the problems that I can lead to, what are the problems that will prevent me from getting a good meditation. So the goal and the means have to be very, very clear. What am I trying to achieve out of meditation? And what do I need to do? Good. So I was hoping to get to Shloka 4. I guess we will do it definitely next week. We'll start with Shloka number 4. It's already 9:30 for you. Yeah. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kasyid dukkha bhag bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. Let me turn off the